Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I wrote that piece over the weekend, Snapshots from South Africa and its role in Africa's economy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. My macro thoughts are the dollar got a caning yesterday. Home thoughts, I'm going to put up this photograph of Hannah in a ball, and she's 8 tomorrow. And I wish her more love and happiness than I can even imagine. And truly, I love her much more than the world and everything in it, and that's a fact. And occasionally I get confused as to who is the parent and who is the child. From there, I'll go back to my quotes from Rumi. We come spinning out of nothingness, scattering stars like dust. And I'll put up a photograph of the whirling dervishes. And when we went to Konya to visit Rumi's mausoleum, we watched a sema in the basement of the mausoleum. Then we came out and there was this full moon. It was just extraordinary. And these words probably confirmed that emotion that I felt as I came out of that sema. Sit, be still, and listen, because you're drunk and we're at the edge of the roof. Political reflections, provocateurs have been sent there to create chaos, Kerry told Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Washington. Russian forces deployed on the border with Ukraine. US and its allies are concerned that Vladimir Putin may be planning further incursions into eastern Ukraine after annexing the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea. In my opinion, an outright invasion of eastern Ukraine is unlikely. Recent events look like a Cold War type setup filled with agents provocateurs, Weaver said by phone from London to Bloomberg. It seems like Russia's just needling Ukraine to see what they can get away with. And I said it's a game of hardball, and Putin has evidently calculated it serves him better to take the fight to Ukraine and not have the fight taken to him. The benchmark MySex index rose 0.2% yesterday. It's fallen 6.4% since the intervention, but remember it's bounced off its lows. I think it's a screaming buy because of the price-earnings ratio. You can basically buy Russia at 4.5 times, and you have very few markets which trade at less than 10. And I, for one, I think it's all about the pivot to Asia and not the pivot to Ukraine. The French Prime Minister Manuel Valls said on Tuesday accusations by Rwandan officials that France was complicit in the genocide that killed 800,000 people were disgraceful. I cannot accept these disgraceful accusations that suggest France could have been complicit in a genocide in Rwanda when its honor is to always separate fighting factions, he said. Speaking to reporters on Tuesday, French Foreign Ministry spokesman Romain Nadal said there was a warm meeting between President Hollande and Kagame in Brussels, which is why we were extremely surprised by these statements. I'll put up a photograph of that meeting and look at the body language and the eye contact. It's fascinating, given what subsequently has happened. And then I'll put up another photograph of the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni and his Rwandan counterpart Paul Kagame following the proceedings of the 20th anniversary commemoration of the genocide in Kigali on Monday. The US defense chief got an earful as China visit exposes tensions, says Reuters. Hagel was sharply questioned by Chinese officers at the National Defense University. One of them told Hagel he was concerned that the United States was stirring up trouble in the East and South China Sea because it feared someday China will be too big a challenge for the United States to cope with. Therefore, you are using such issues to make trouble to hamper China's development. Hagel assured the audience that America has no interest in trying to contain China, and that it took no position in such disputes, but he also cautioned repeatedly during the day that the United States would stand by its allies. We have mutual self-defense treaties with each of those two countries, Hegel said, referring to Japan and the Philippines, and we're fully committed to those treaty obligations. As the PLA modernizes its capabilities and expands its presence in Asia and beyond, American and Chinese forces will be drawn into closer proximity, which increases the risk of an incident, an accident, or a miscalculation, he said. But this reality also presents new opportunities for cooperation. The risks of a mishap were highlighted in December when the American guided missile cruiser USS Cowpens had to take evasive action in the South China Sea to avoid hitting a Chinese warship operating in support of the Liaoning. Chang, now this is the Chinese military defense chief, asked the United States to keep Japan within bounds and not to be permissive and supportive, and railed against the government of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, whom Hegel met in Tokyo last weekend. It is Japan who's being provocative against China, Chang told a news conference after talks with Hegel. If you come to the conclusion that China is going to resort to force against Japan, that is wrong. We will not take the initiative to stir up troubles. And then they had a pop at the Philippines. Chang called the Philippines a nation disguising itself as a victim and renewed its opposition to Manila's pursuit of international arbitration. Hegel, of course, cautioned that no countries should resort to intimidation, coercion, or aggression to advance their claims. I'll put up a photograph of the US Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and the Chinese Minister of Defense Chang Wen-Quan. I'll also put up a photograph of the snake, which was an installation that Ai Weiwei placed in the Hershon, and I think it best symbolizes the policy of containment. And repeat what I previously said, that it's crystal clear that the US owns a decisive advantage at this moment, and that this hard power leadership is set to erode over time. Therefore, I think there is real bite behind the pivot, because the nature of advantages is you need to press them. The blinding attack envisaged under the air-sea battle concept fails to cross the politically feasible threshold. The disproportionate response might be feasible in a national security workshop, but I'm afraid it looks plain untenable in the 21st century. Far more probable is the idea of distant blockade operations, i.e. the encirclement of China, and then effectively blockading the country. Essentially, the US can be, and probably is, China's gatekeeper. It's a chokehold. Then I was extrapolating from that, if you're considering distant blockade operations, one of those areas you will be blockading is this part of the world, given the amount of energy that is likely to be sold into Asia in the future. I saw this headline, I couldn't resist: Color Revolutions, Ukraine versus Thailand. What is the end game? I think indeed we are all asking that. I like this photograph of Mogadishu, the Banadir Regional Administration from the 1930s, and then this view towards government quarters in downtown Mogadishu, I think taken quite recently. The IMF released their World Economic Outlook. Interesting reading. Recovery strengthens, remains uneven. Although we are far short of a full recovery, the normalization of monetary policy, both conventional and unconventional, is now on the agenda. Saying this will create a tougher financial environment, investors will be less forgiving, and macroeconomic weaknesses will become more costly. Acute risks have decreased, but risks have not disappeared. Geopolitical risks have arisen, although they have not yet had global macroeconomic repercussions. Global activity has broadly strengthened, is expected to improve further in 2014-2015. Much of the impetus coming from advanced economies, a theme they began last year. Looking ahead, global growth is projected to strengthen from 3% in 2013 to 3.6% in 2014, 0.1% less than previously, and 3.9% in 2015. Growth will be strongest in the United States at about 2.75%. Emerging market developing economies growth is projected to pick up gradually from 4.7% in 2013 to about 5% in 2014 and 5.25% in 2015. China, thus expecting 7.5% GDP expansion in 2014. Global recovery is still fragile despite improved prospects. Significant downside risks, both old and new, remain. Recently, some new geopolitical risks have emerged. Currency markets, the euro has popped back up to the 138 level. The dollar index took a big hit, last trading at 79.80. Japanese yen back at the 102.02 level, and it's been very consistent in that trading range, you'll notice. Swiss franc 0.8837, the pound 167.52, not far off 168.23, which it reached on Feb 17, which was the highest level since November 2009. Aussie much stronger, 0.9369, touched 0.9387, stronger since November 20. India rupee just on the 60 level at 60.035. South Korean won 1042.47, climbed to the highest level since August 2008. The Real 220.16 gained for a third straight day and has closed the strongest level since October 30. So you can see real strength through that card. And dollar weakness. Egyptian pound 697.46 and the rand 1043.67. It's the pound which has been the strongest currency over the last 12 months, up 11%. Dollar has declined 0.3% and the euro has appreciated 6.5%. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index at 79.80 last. Took a fearful beating yesterday. Euro dollar back around the 138 level. I think essentially the ECB seems to have rowed back a little bit from its quantitative easing strategy that it was sort of floating out there. Dollar yen 102.02, sterling I'll put up a 1-year chart, 167.50 last. I spoke about this on the 2nd of August when I said how does an investor play this UK recovery, and I said you need to be net long sterling, and I said then I like looking for narratives that are embedded and entrenched and where I can see an inflection point. The United Kingdom, Europe and the US have reflected. Watch closely how the narrative starts changing, and a good example of that is the IMF World Economic Update. The IMF is saying the UK economy will expand 2.9% in 2014 and 2.5% next year. Warned that the recovery remains uneven, but essentially predicts the UK will expand the most among the G7 this year, outpacing the US. The UK economy has turned the corner, said Richard Fanulovich. I'm sure there will be doubters out there, but evidence we've got so far suggests growth is well entrenched and broad-based this time. It doesn't look like another false dawn. Samsung, and I'm looking forward to going to the launch party tomorrow of the S5, but I found this report interesting in Business Insider, which is describing the S5 as one of the best 5.1-inch screen, much larger, more striking than the 4-inch display on the iPhone S5. The screen has a lot of built-in tech like a sensor that can adjust the display for better viewing in direct sunlight, another one that can alter the colors based on the lighting in the room. And none of this is noticeable unless you're looking for it. It's the best screen I've ever seen on a phone. Camera is spectacular, and it is, but I tested it yesterday. Shoots at 16 megapixels, but the real treat is something called Live HDR, which lets you get a preview of what your photo will look like in HDR mode before you snap it. It results in some really nice photos, especially if lighting conditions aren't very good. Between the camera, the brilliant 5.1-inch display and the smoother software, the S5 is one of the best phones you can buy. So I'm looking forward to that enormously, and I'm doing a little bit of work with them. As I said to the lady who keeps giving me all these wonderful new products, that we've got a great relationship, and I hope she keeps it that way, just giving me gifts all the time. Gold, I'm going to put up a 1-year chart, 1312.31. I still think the 2014 high has already been seen. Crude oil, now above 102 at 102.28, highest close since March 7th. I'm looking to resell it. Frontier markets, I found this report interesting. Quartz, China is now drilling holes in the roof of the world. Drilled a deep borehole in the Tibetan Plateau, 4,500 meters above sea level, a project whose location has been kept secret as part of China's hopes to exploit the region's vast supplies of oil, gas, and minerals. And saying estimates that the plateau, which encompasses Tibet, Qinghai, and parts of Guangzhou, Sichuan, and Yunnan provinces, could hold the world's largest oil and gas deposit, some 10 billion tons. In that report by the IMF, the World Economic Outlook, page 68 is where they go to sub-Saharan Africa. Jump into that point, and if you want to go and read it, go to Rich Wrap-Ups. There are plenty of links there. The IMF is saying growth in sub-Saharan Africa remains robust, expected to accelerate in 2014. Tight global financing conditions or a slowdown in emerging market economies could generate some external headwinds, especially for middle-income countries with large external linkages, producers of natural resources, frontier economies. Some of the most salient risks are domestic, stemming from policy missteps in various countries. That's a big issue. Security threats, well, don't we know about that? And domestic political uncertainties ahead of elections. Growth in sub-Saharan Africa remained strong in 2013 at 4.8%, virtually unchanged from 2012. Growth was robust throughout the region, especially low-income, fragile states. Nigeria's growth remained strong because of relatively high oil prices. South Africa continued to decelerate, constrained by tense industrial relations in the mining sector, tight electricity supply, anemic private investment, weak consumer demand, and investor confidence. But I think that's on the mend now. Growth is expected to accelerate to about 5.5% in 2014. So pretty constructive report talking about improved domestic political security situation in Mali, massive investments in infrastructure and mining, DRC, Congo, Mozambique, Niger, maturing investments in Mozambique. But looking at saying, largest downside risks are domestic, including policy uncertainty, deteriorating security conditions, industrial tensions. External risks are particularly important for natural resource exporters, which could suffer from a slowdown in emerging markets and a shifting pattern in China. That's the key risk. I like this quote from Warburg Pincus: Africa is the next big frontier in private equity, and we're spending an increasing amount of time investigating opportunities in that region. South African all-share bounced yesterday. It's up 5.22% this year, not far off an all-time high. I wrote that piece, Snapshots from South Africa and its role in Africa's economy. I was talking about driving that rather lovely Jaguar and saying it simply purred. We stayed at the Fairway Hotel and Golf Resort, which transpired on a Friday night at that happy hour time to be the very epicenter of the Afrikaner heartland in Johannesburg, and it was fascinating to watch. I found myself in that happy hour with Africa's white tribe. It was a curious experience and a very tribal one. South Africa is a big beast on the continent, notwithstanding its softness around recent growth. I think South Africa Inc. is taking a much more aggressive position on the continent. The Rand fell 20% January 2013 through February 14. It has rebounded sharply in the last 2 weeks. I think the adjustment there in the Rand is set to prove quite supportive for South African exports. And I wrote over the weekend, the Rand appears to have snapped a more than 12-month downtrend, and that is a constructive forward indicator. And I concluded by saying, Nigeria rebasing or not, South Africa plays a heavyweight role in sub-Saharan Africa, and its economy is stabilized and, in my opinion, is improving. I'll put up that photograph I took of the Johannesburg sunset as seen looking across the fairway at the Fairway Hotel and Golf Resort. Dollar Rand, we're at 10.43.66, and it looks like we're going to 10. The Rand yesterday traded at its strongest level on an intraday basis since January the 1st. And as I said, it appears to have snapped a more than 12-month downtrend. Egyptian pound 697.46. Egyptian stock market rebounded 2.32% yesterday. We've come off sharply since March 25, although the index remains up 14.41% this year. Nigerian stock market down 4.76% in 2014. Ghana Stock Exchange plus 9.63%. But when you take into account the SEDI, which has fallen 14.6% this year after a 20% drop last year, you are in a negative situation. And I wrote about this on the 24th of March, when I said the open question is whether Ghana is in the cockpit or whether the markets will simply elbow the government aside. Ghana's Eurobond, I think, is still trading with a 9% handle. South Africa's Massmart is to enter Angola with 2 stores. The CEO said the company, which is 51% owned by Walmart, was building its first store in Kenya after failing to clinch unspecified acquisitions that would have given it a substantial footprint in East Africa's biggest economy. That's interesting news. He also said going into Africa is not a cookie cutter. If it was more cookie cutter, we could roll out a lot quicker, but it's not. It's really getting into those markets and understanding them. I wrote about this when for the Christian Science Monitor, when I said in September 2010, Walmart could lead corporate America into Africa. Reuters is carrying a report about retailers chasing reward in booming but volatile Africa, referring to Kano in Nigeria, where apparently a lot of the retailers are looking to open. The insurer Sanlam plans 3 to 4 African acquisitions this year. Again in Reuters, I would hope to have one wrapped up either in Mozambique or in Angola. I would hope for 1 or 2 in East Africa. Sanlam's Margaret Dawes told the Reuters Africa Summit 3 or 4, I would hope. The number 1 insurer by market value, South Africa's number 1 insurer by market value, is looking to increase its controlling stake in Kenya's Pan-Africa Insurance, which has had that phenomenal rally. I made a presentation at the East Africa Property Summit. The link is on Rich Wrap-Ups, and I'll put up a photograph of myself making that presentation that day. West Africa's Ebola outbreak is among the most challenging ever to strike since the disease emerged 4 decades ago, the WHO said Tuesday, as the suspected death toll from the virus hit 111. We have not had an Ebola outbreak in this part of Africa before, said Fukuda. This is one of the most challenging Ebola outbreaks we've ever faced. The virus can be transmitted to humans from wild animals and between humans through direct contact with another's blood, feces, or sweat. Sexual contact or the unprotected handling of contaminated corpses can also lead to infection. Very interesting piece, and I've had to take it off in full, which is rather naughty of the FT. They get upset with that. But it's talking about investors in corrupt New Africa repeat old errors. Saying when investors buy bonds sold by sleaze-ridden governments, it is as surely as dubious as giving a bottle of whiskey to a known alcoholic. It is not against the law, but at best it is unethical and immoral, and the giver is complicit in the consequences. Africa's leaders proved deeply disappointing. Foreign lenders nevertheless indulged big men in their vanity projects. Saying that this is talking about the bubble, saying by the early 70s the continent was unable to service its external debt. Then talking about Africa's position, saying taking on a lot more debt, and making some very hard-hitting comments with regard to Kenya. Can Kenya, for example, this is the FT, the link is on Rich Wrap-Ups, which is planning a $2 billion bond issue, be trusted? 2 massive scams cost the country billions based on bogus export claims and false invoices have gone unpunished. Questions are being asked about the construction of a $2 billion Kenya railway with contracts that lack transparency. It's a pretty hard-hitting. South Africa's Woolworths Holdings have agreed to buy the Australian retailer David Jones for $2.15 billion Australian dollars. We're building this business to build a bigger Southern Hemisphere brand, said Ian Moore, the Woolworths CEO. We've got real scale in the Southern Hemisphere. We've got the same seasonality, so we've got a real competitive advantage over Northern Hemisphere entrants. The president has been travelling here in Kenya, well, outside Kenya. This is a photograph he twit-picked meeting with the Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. When I called called on him at his office in Ankara, Turkey, and I wondered to myself that Twitter ban must not apply to visiting heads of state. Our president does like using it and is effective at it. And then as I was scrolling through his feed, I came across this other twitpic of meeting with Sudan President Omar al-Bashir on arrival at Khartoum airport while on his way to meet with Erdogan in Turkey from Rwanda. The Kenyan official said at least 3,000 people have been arrested during 4 days of security operations following a wave of terror attacks. 447 are being held in custody under anti-terrorism laws that allow police to hold suspects longer than 24 hours. The Africa Report is reporting on base titanium, a Kenyan mining milestone. It starts by saying Australia's base titanium is in tense royalty talks with the Kenyan government for its first shipment of ilmenite. Speaking with Joe Schwartz and talking about the volatility around the situation and around the calculation of royalties. I think there are still some open questions. According to the Star, Minister's been pushing for base to increase its royalty payments from 5% to 10%, 5% being the world norm, 10% would be double the world average, and to give up a 10% equity stake to the government. The problem with that is, of course, that's retroactive. So it remains, Africa's, Kenya's flagship mining project with over $300 million sunk into it. Of course, I went down for that first shipment and I put up a photograph of the Cabinet Secretary, Najib Balala, Joe Schwartz, who's spoken over that article, and Colin getting ready to load the first ilmenite consignment. I'll put up a photograph of the baobab tree, which they preserved on their mining site, and it's a magnificent specimen of a baobab. A link I'm going to now put up to Kenya History, which is a series of photographs of Nairobi going back to the turn of the century. And then I'll put up my photograph of Nairobi taken from the 8th floor 77 days ago. The Kenya shilling is very solid at 86.60. The Nairobi all-share turned marginally high yesterday. It's up 4.55% in 2014. The NSE 20 is down 0.906% in 2014, firmed 0.26%. I think security-related concerns have taken some of the energy out of the bulls, but that might now be priced in. And there's a link on the on-ridge wrap-ups right at the bottom if you want to check into any share, the results or anything else you can to have a look at. There's plenty of data. And remember, you can follow the market live in trading hours if you just register on rich.co.ke, get a password, and then go to Rich Live. You can leave it on your screen, check anything you wish, because demand and supply is a key way of trading this market. And without it, you really don't know the situation. Once again, thanks for stopping by.